Thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Jameson Berkow. I'm a financial journalist based here in Canada, the largest, at least physically, legal cannabis market in the world. I'm joined by Emily Galvin-Almanza. She is the co-founder and co-executive director of Partners for Justice, a national access to justice nonprofit. Emily, thanks so much for being with us for this conversation. Alex Khourdaji is the analyst at Prohibition Partners, as well as being the author of the North American Cannabis Market Report and a number of other Prohibition Partners reports, and basically anything else Prohibition Partners tells him to do, he is not standing on his head because they didn't tell him to. Hi, Alex. And finally on our list, we have Stacey Walker. He is a member of the Lynn County Board of Supervisors in Iowa, and of course, he played a key role at the Democratic National Convention last year as a delegate with the Bernie Sanders campaign. Of course, Stacey, you had the honor of trying to twist the arms of some Biden delegates to accept the Sanders view on cannabis legalization policy. Is quite a certainly an important role to play. And thank you so much for making the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Alex, we're going to start with you. One of the really interesting parts of this report, and something that I certainly found unique among the other information sources that are out there on the North American cannabis market, is you actually went out and tried to amalgamate and break down all the different social equity programs that are part of the legalization regimes in several U.S. states. So maybe you could start off, walk us through, how you actually went and found all that information, and then how were you able to differentiate the different programs from low or moderate or high impact in terms of actually achieving the social equity that they're aiming to achieve?
Well, looking at just social equity programs in general, it was fascinating to me to see that there's been already so much progress. Well, the thought of progress already happening. I mean, we're already seeing these new states coming in, such as Arizona, already adopting a social equity program for the state. So going into it, I was researching what kind of initiatives each program has in a statewide level. So I was looking at, do they have access to do social equity programs have access to capital? Are there discounted licensing fees for these communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs? Are there grants to individuals who have been affected by cannabis criminalization? So literally going through each and every process. Is there even criminal expungement reform in these states? So it was very important to see basically, where are we seeing the most progress and where are we seeing a lot of initiatives happening? And then I would go on a state-by-state level and looking at each and every state and seeing what their viewpoint is and how impactful that actually is, and looking at research and reports and also articles from various individuals if it's actually helping them or not, if they actually feel like there's a block happening.
So Stacey, how useful is it to have a resource where all of these different programs are kind of listed all together and ranked to the extent that they can be?
Well, it's incredibly important, and I think the report does a good job of literally going state by state. The states that had cannabis policy on the ballot in 2020, that was a huge development, and it's telling that these states not only had cannabis, the question of cannabis legalization on the ballot, whether it was for recreational use or medicinal use, but that the conversation really here in the United States has been anchored in racial justice, which I think is different from years past. And I think it was aided by the fact that in this last presidential election, one of the most consequential presidential elections in the modern era, every candidate running for president on the Democratic side, when they talked about cannabis policy, talked about racial justice, which of course dovetails into some of the social programs that Alex was mentioning. So this is a very important development here in the United States.
What do you think about the programs themselves, though, Stacey? I mean, there's a lot of debate, and I know Alex tried to the extent he's able to, it's such a subjective issue, to sort of stress test the effectiveness. I know, Alex, you were getting at that, but it's a complicated issue to try and address, obviously. What do you make of efforts thus far to try and provide some level of social and racial equity in cannabis legalization programs? I mean, there's been some programs that have been more successful than others.
Right. In short, the efforts are valiant. I'm glad that we are having these conversations, and each state sort of serves as a laboratory for experiment here, as there isn't really any cohesive federal direction. So it's kind of up to the states. But what I think is important is that slowly but surely there is recognition that there have been certain communities, particularly communities of color, that have been disproportionately impacted by cannabis laws here. So you talk about this reinvestment in communities of color so that they too may share in some of this newly generated wealth. I mean, that's another thing that this report does, is it shows you the breakdowns of cannabis sales here, and the projected sales into 2025 is expected to be, I think, somewhere north of $30 billion. So there's all this new wealth generated, and I am glad here in the United States that historically doesn't have a good track record of keeping the interests of people of color in mind, are talking about sharing in that wealth. We're talking about the expungement of criminal records as a result of the crime bill in the early 90s that really exploded the police state and over-criminalized and severely punished people of color in the effort to rid our country of the evil drug marijuana. So these conversations are happening, and quite honestly, in the United States, that is a big deal. Now, as to the effectiveness, again, that speaks to the different states' approach, and I think we're going to learn a lot in the coming years about the most effective way to approach these issues.
Emily, I want to give you a chance to jump in. What do you think of the progress that's been made so far while we're still on the social equity component?
Yeah, I think I would really echo what Stacey said in terms of the hole we're trying to dig ourselves out of. Marijuana arrests have decreased slightly in the last 10 years in the United States, but not enough. I mean, according to the ACLU, there were still over 6 million arrests in the time between 2010 and 2018. And those arrests fell disproportionately on the backs of people of color. People of color were 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than Black or brown Americans. And that's just the arrests, right? Just the arrests for marijuana. When you think of all the times that people were stopped and frisked or stopped and had their cars searched, and perhaps some other violation was found, an unpaid fine or fee or truancy from school. I mean, the more people have contact with the police, the more their lives are damaged by that contact. No contact is simple, especially for young people. Any contact can be really, really traumatizing, and any arrest can hamper a person's employability, their educational continuity, even their child custody. I mean, I could spend an entire hour talking about what happens to Black moms in this country who are found to have marijuana in their system. They lose their children, and white moms don't. So the hole we're trying to dig ourselves out of isn't just economic. It's like this massive bomb that has been set off continually for decades in the Black and brown community. So when we talk about what legalization can do, it's great that a lot of these initiatives are talking about making expungement and record clearance free and automatic and not requiring people to jump through hoops to do it. That's hugely important. It's great that we're talking about initiatives that can push some of that wealth that's being generated towards Black and brown people who have had their economic mobility hampered by decades of hyper-policing and arrest. But it's going to be really complicated because you can't just look at the group of people who were arrested for marijuana. You have to look at people who had contact with the criminal system as a derivative result of marijuana. I mean, I was a public defender for the better part of 10 years, and I can tell you that like the smell of marijuana is the most popular reason for police to say they had contact with somebody. And that contact can be absolutely devastating. So the level of damage we're dealing with here is tremendous, and it's going to take a really long time, even for the most thoughtful initiatives, to begin to rebalance what's been done.
So, Stacey, one of the points that you and I addressed in the interview that we did previously, that's actually a part of this report, was the focus on potentially too much. I don't want to say too much. Actually, it's obviously you can't have too much justice, right? It's like too much joy. But the notion that perhaps the only real legislative progress that we'll see in 2021 is likely to come sooner and more likely to be part of the larger COVID relief package that's being discussed, and that progress is likely to be in much more economic terms as opposed to the terms we're discussing now. So what do you make of that? I guess what my question there is, do you think that there's a risk of, for lack of a better term, backlash if there's too much emphasis on the racial justice component of legalization? Putting aside that whether it's justified or not, obviously, I think we're all in agreement it's entirely justified. But just in terms of strict, practical political terms, and I ask you this because I know that you were involved with the DNC and arguing for the Bernie policy to the Biden delegates, and you managed to convince a good number of them on that view. So what's the political reality here as far as actually advancing legislation that would address these issues at a federal level?
Well, like most things, the political reality is complex. I mean, here you have the Democrats that control the House and will now have a majority in the Senate and occupy the White House. And the Democratic Party writ large, I believe, is further along than President Biden on cannabis policy in this country. And the Senate Democrats have said just recently that cannabis policy is going to be a priority for the Democrats, which is a little different posture they had heading into this past general election. So you have that dynamic at play. But to your original question, what is the risk of backlash if there is a heavy focus on the racial equity component of some of these laws? And unfortunately, I think there's a very real chance of that. We have one major party in the United States, the Republican Party, that in many ways is incredibly backward on issues of racial justice. And in a lot of ways, outright wrong and bigoted. And we are still having to deal with that in our politics at every level, at the federal level, down to the state level, and in the local level of our politics. America is still struggling with the race issue. And so that's a very real thing. And I think, Democrats are going to have to decide if they are going to address that challenge head on and stand with conviction and ensure that in any cannabis law, there is some focus on racial equity and racial justice, or if they are going to cave into cowardice, I will say. I know a lot of Democrats, a lot of the position of many conservative Democrats in this country is to walk softly and take an incremental approach to all this because they are afraid of losing majorities in the midterm elections that are going to happen in about 2 years here. Majorities in our legislative bodies in Congress and the Senate. And that my personal philosophy is you don't want to operate out of fear, but you want to do what's right. And typically doing what's right is also good politics. And I'm hopeful that we have enough Democrats who understand that.
So to broaden out that topic a little bit beyond America, since the North American report, I thought I'd bring Mexico into the conversation because, certainly communities in Mexico, I mean, you could even go back to the stereotype and frankly, historically inaccurate understanding of how cannabis got into American culture, right? The belief that it was, quote unquote, carried by Mexican laborers in the early 1900s across the border. Obviously, Mexico now itself is moving towards legalization. Alex, maybe you want to start off the conversation there because you've been very patient and quiet throughout this so far. What do you imagine, based on the research that you and I have been able to do, we will see from Mexico this year, if they actually do? I know they've kicked the can a number of times, but let's assume they stop doing that and actually enact some legislation. How do you imagine the dynamic of the North American market is going to change when all of a sudden 140 million people are living in a legal cannabis market?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I think it's going to have a very impactful change in just a world community itself for the cannabis industry worldwide, internationally. But thinking to what the US's reaction is going to be quite difficult to estimate. But I could imagine that there might be a push, a strong, either it can go both ways, right? It could either go a strong push against, against imports from Mexico, or
right.
some sort like that, or it is going to be a kind of accelerate, like the federal reform or some state reforms near Mexico are going to accelerate their legislation towards cannabis legalization. I think that's a very, very important, a very interesting subject to talk about, as not many people are actually thinking about that. What would the impact actually be for the US? It'd be interesting to see, certainly.
Yeah. Emily, any thoughts on the impact Mexican legalization will have? I know there's been a lot of talk about Texas lately. Could they go green?
Texas is a changing state. Absolutely. I mean, what we saw, first of all, when we talk about partisan politics in the context of marijuana, it's a little bit misplaced because marijuana is much more popular than any general set of partisan beliefs, right? So while there might have been a time where we were like Democrats are pro, Republicans are con, now we've got 70% general support for legalization, and
Republican lawmakers don't seem to reflect that view.
There are so many policies that poll well with ordinary voters. I actually just wrote an article on how many sort of traditionally thought of as progressive policies are actually polling really well with conservatives, but their leadership hasn't realized what the voters want yet. And that's going to be a learning process for them. But focusing for a second on Mexican legalization and Texas. Texas is a changing state. We are absolutely seeing states especially states that are adjacent to states with broader legalization and states that are profiting from a robust cannabis market. We're seeing jealousy in the sister states, right? They're watching their others being like, wait a minute, they're making a ton of tax revenue off of this. But I would also just say there's a federal point here too, right? If you've got real legalization in Mexico and the possibility of real trade with jurisdictions in which marijuana is legal, you have a much greater pressure on the federal government to change federal law regarding marijuana in order to enable trade across borders. I mean, cross-border trade is a huge, huge issue already in the States. I think the report talks about how long it takes to get permits to bring marijuana across state lines. And if we're really going to make this into a market that is beneficial to states and to their school systems and to their public, utilities and all of that, we're going to need federal support for international trade.
So, Stacey, you're the closest thing on this panel to a resident of the southern United States. In Iowa, you could you could probably go both ways. But I'm definitely curious to know your view on the progress of legalization, because I know, Emily, you touched on a really interesting point there, the jealousy. I know there's a lot of conversations on states adjacent to New Jersey, for example, that are looking at legalization simply because New Jersey is. So, yeah, Stacey, what do you think we're going to see in the southern United States, if anything? I mean, we have some surprisingly positive responses from ballot questions in places that you would never. It's like Mississippi. It's quite a shock, I think, to a lot of people.
Right. Yeah. I would love to get Emily's view on whether or not Iowa qualifies as a southern state, as she is an Iowa native. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Iowa is smack dab in the middle of the country. To our east is Illinois, which has completely legalized recreational cannabis there. South Dakota, which borders us from the northwest, has legalized as well. And I think states like Minnesota and Wisconsin, our neighbors to the north, are well on their way. So what you have, and those states love it, that Iowa has not legalized cannabis because they're taking revenue from us. If you live on a border town here in any one of those states or any one of those areas, you're traveling over the border and purchasing marijuana, and you're spending money in their state and adding to their coffers. So that's a real thing for states, and we are losing out on billions of dollars in potential revenue opportunities because we continue to drag our feet here in Iowa. But to your point about the southern states, and to Emily's point earlier, that cannabis policy, marijuana reform, is growing and has growing support across all demographics, across all regions, across party affiliations. This is something that I expect will continue to grow as states continue to benefit from marijuana reform in their policies and benefit from the revenues it generates. And as you mentioned, it's not just the progressive states, South Dakota and Arizona and Montana and Florida here. So we've got states that run the sort of ideological spectrum really starting to understand the benefits here. And I expect that to continue. And I don't really expect there to be any sort of traditional demarcation or divide between northern states and southern states. Everyone is starting to wisen up. And I think that's going to put pressure on our federal government to act.
So no modern incarnation of the Mason-Dixon line? No,
not at all.
Line, or
to which Iowa, the north, just to be clear.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, there was a helpful geography lesson, actually, to those of us who live in the second largest physical country in the world, but everything is still somehow right next door. So we're all just hugging the U.S. border anyway.
It's just like a studio apartment above a great party. I mean, that's really
yeah. That's a Robin Williams line, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
Down there, eh? So, I love the political and the legality questions. Are obviously hugely important in ways that really can't be expressed in a half-hour conversation. I do want to make some time, though, for the just nitty-gritty product issues that the report raises, because I think it's interesting to note, obviously, particularly in North America, maybe not so much in Mexico, but certainly Canada and the United States, smoking itself, whether you're talking about cannabis or just cigarettes, is taboo now. It is. You could attach any sort of negative term you want to it. It's certainly broadly frowned upon, and yet the progress towards non-smokable cannabis options, like there's tons of options out there. I know there's beverages and edibles and capsules, and Canada in particular has tons of those options now because they're all processed by pharmaceutical companies. Folks aren't buying them, though. They don't want them. They want, the sales data in our report just shows this to a T. People want the dried cannabis flower. They want to roll it up and smoke it. And I guess I might give this an open question for the whole panel, and just whoever sort of pipes up first. What is it going to take to evolve the sort of next level of the industry? Because clearly legalization is not what's holding it back. You know, we have federal legalization here in Canada. We've had it for, going on 3 years now. We have every product you could possibly imagine. I mean, I bought some under tongue dissolving strips that they used to have for mouthwash. Now you can make them for cannabis. It's insane. But there's no uptake, just absolutely none. It's like 1% of sales if you look at, say, beverages in particular. So why do you guys imagine that is the case, and what do you think will be required to make that change? And like I said, I don't have anyone particular in mind. So
my area of expertise is not really in use. It's much more in enforcement. Although I would say that for jurisdictions where edibles are treated the same as smokable marijuana, and edibles of various kinds or under tongue, you know, whatever other type of product does not create an odor, and where an odor can still give rise to probable cause for police contact, I would think that non-smellable forms of marijuana should be much more popular. But that's my only lens on this.
Well, that's an interesting point that makes me think, if they were more popular, right? How much of the stigma attached to cannabis has to do with the very noticeable and distinct smell that comes from smoking it, right? That does seem to be, like say here in my province of Ontario, for example. Hi, Alex, welcome back.
Sorry.
That's all right. Like here in my home province of Ontario, the Premier, Doug Ford, has said, you know, I don't mind walking past, you know, some folks on a park bench if they have, you know, some beers in a paper bag and they're drinking it, even though that is just as against the law as consuming cannabis in public. But then in his next breath, he said, but I don't want to have to walk past a bunch of folks smoking a joint. And I know the first main point of that is, you know, you don't like the smell, but I'm curious if that's just an excuse to basically be racist, you know, and like, I don't know if I'm being too blunt there, but like Emily or Stacey, what are your thoughts on the odor and the sort of excuse that odor creates for people to either just be against cannabis or to express potentially bigoted views that, you know, this gives them cover or justification to do so? Like, what are your thoughts on that? I know we're getting a bit further afield, but it's a neat idea.
No, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, there's always going to be the sort of cultural nuances that come with how people perceive marijuana and other cannabis products, even if they are legal in their area, compared to other traditional drugs like alcohol that wasn't always legal in America either. And so I think you're going to have those. But I do want to go back to the question of edibles and non-smokable forms of cannabis. I am not convinced by the market research here that is going to be something that does not grow in popularity. In fact, I think as soon as you have Beyonce or Taylor Swift start branding edibles or other cannabis products, you will see an explosion here in the United States in those products.
Jay-Z's done it already.
I'm sorry?
Jay-Z's done it.
Well, there you go. There's one half of
one half of the Jay-Z. That's what made me think of it, right?
But you know, I travel to California quite often for business and for other things, and it is a lucrative market in California, and there are, as you talked about earlier, there's a cannabis product for everyone. You know, there are there are beverages and there are oils and other products, and they are widely consumed. If I'm a betting man and I am not offering stock advice here or where it could be investing, but I wouldn't count edibles out. I wouldn't count non-smokable products out. I think as marijuana laws across this country continue to change, and as sort of marijuana becomes more mainstream culturally, and more Americans start to use the product, even though there's already high use among Americans right now, I think there is a significant place for edibles and non-smokable cannabis products.
So am I just being impatient?
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just to chime in,
Yes, please, Alex.
I'm in there. I also think that I agree with Stacey that it's going to grow in the future, and especially we're seeing now younger generations who do not smoke at all and find the whole smoking taboo. Where now it used to be that smoking was peer pressure and everyone got involved and it was cool, but now it's a major taboo in the younger generation. And I think as they progress and they get older and they get introduced to the medical cannabis industry and the adult use market, you're going to see a shift. I think a considerable shift, actually, because prior to that, I mean, a lot of us could only smoke cannabis illegally, which had to be smoked.
Right.
You can just buy edibles, or you can buy vape products or oils or tinctures. You just had to smoke what you were provided.
Right.
So that's definitely one of the insights I think it's going to happen.
We're coming up on the last moment of our conversation. Sorry, Alex, I didn't mean to cut you short there, but I want to give everybody a chance to just reflect maybe on the year ahead, and if we were all together a year from now, what would be the one thing that you think you would probably reflect back on for 2021 and think like, oh, I did not expect that to happen in the cannabis market. Like what might that be? And Emily, did you your facial expression suggests you have something in mind?
Oh God, well, that's just my face. No, I think what I was thinking of is I'm obviously not a market analyst, and I'm not an expert in the business side, other than what I've gleaned from public defense. So what I would say is, to me, the goal is to get as many people out of cages, and not just out of physical cages, but out of the sort of invisible cages of a hampered future, right? Marijuana criminalization has ruined so many people's futures. So when I think about the best way to do that, and what I would be looking for in 2021, when we have, for the first time in many years, the real opportunity to push for better law in this country, I actually see investors and the market and people who are doing the work of building the profitability of this product as being my best hope for legal change. Because in my perhaps cynical view, politicians are much more responsive to money than to justice. I hate to say it, but I think it's true. And I think seeing booming tax revenue and the opportunities that provides for new initiatives in states and federally is the best possible argument for making lives better for the people that I care about and serve. So I guess my hope for 2021 is that we have the right mix of business opportunity and political will, and that perhaps the business side of things can really drive some true liberation in this country.
Stacey, what about you?
I always appreciate sharing space and time with Emily, because she just says it so well, and I think she's absolutely right. And it's not cynical at all to suggest that as more people start making money, our politics will change. That's just the way our politics operates right now, and it's terribly unfortunate. But as soon as pharmaceutical companies with their big PACs start realizing that there is a profit motive to be had when they are developing cannabis products, they are going to start contributing to politicians to make it easier. We're already starting to see some of that happen with politicians trying to get on board with the SAFE Act, which more or less allows for the streamlining of tax avenues and federal trading opportunities for the cannabis industry here in the United States. So we're seeing that already, and we're seeing some of that even being talked about in these larger ongoing pandemic relief bills that are happening. So money tends to move politicians in this country. And while that is a problem, it is also my hope that we can get some of these massive corporations that are looking to benefit, and even, state and local governments that are looking to benefit, to do so and in the right way. And as Emily talked about, that mix of that could create the perfect storm for a promising future in cannabis policy here in the United States. But one other thing I will throw out there is, and I'm not giving up hope on this, I do think we could be surprised as President Biden's view on cannabis continues to evolve, along with the pressure that I think a lot of Democrats are going to put on this administration to act. I do think we could see more robust action emanating from the White House if we continue to see Democrats in the House and in the Senate lead the way on these issues in a progressive manner. I really think we could see action there. It is no secret that President Biden has come to realize the devastating impact of the crime bill in the early 90s that he played an instrumental role in. And I think in his efforts to atone and rectify, I do think his thinking will evolve, and I do think there is a chance we could see major action on cannabis policy here in the United States.
So, and that's an excellent point to be making, Stacey, particularly at this juncture where I've just been informed that I was misunderstanding how much time we have. We have another 10 minutes still, and which is great because I know Emily had a point she wanted to add to the argument, Stacey, you were just rolling out.
Yeah, just Stacey, like I said, like Stacey just said, we love being in the same space because we're just bouncing off each other, which is awesome. I wanted to understand what he said. What Stacey just brought up about corporate interests and pharma packs, I think we really haven't paid enough attention to the role that not just companies but consumers should be and must be playing in equity here. So we can look to legislation across the board to create space for formerly incarcerated people or people with marijuana convictions to benefit from legalization, right? Like, it's ridiculous to live in a country where I can buy cannabis stocks and I literally know people who are sitting in cages for selling cannabis too soon. So we have to be very, right, they were just ahead of their time. And we have to be intentional about routing that profit toward people who have been negatively impacted. That's not just a legislative concern. So big companies who are going to begin distributing, producing, profiting from marijuana can be pressured by consumers to build in space for formerly incarcerated people who have had negative impact from marijuana enforcement in their lifetimes, to be working within their ambit. And I think that elections only happen once every so often. So you only get to really hold your politicians' feet to the fire like every few years. But consumers can place a lot of pressure on corporate interests to be doing the things that legislation also should do and ensuring that they are prioritizing system impacted people for roles in their industry.
On that point, actually, I think it's quite interesting, given the pharmaceutical question, right, and the fact that the MORE Act, I know, is something that has been discussed and actually achieved more progress than many had expected the last time it was raised in the House, actually passing all the way through the House. So if that were to pass, since you mentioned the pharmaceutical question, one thing the report that we just put out delves into a little bit, and I see, Alex, you're nodding along, you see where I'm going with this, is what does that mean for the regulatory environment? Alex, maybe you can take us through the challenge that could potentially create in ways that might actually make the cannabis industry more regulated, more challenged?
Yeah, so just thinking about it, if it does get, federally legalized, and what pharmaceutical cannabis or medical cannabis and cannabis itself gets legalized and is federally, therefore federally, under the federal jurisdiction, one can expect that the FDA will get a hold of it. And once the FDA gets a hold of it, there might be a lot of red tape, which might make it harder for smaller companies to adhere and follow all of these specific rules of just when it comes to plantation all across the supply chain. It might be that the big companies who are already established will have the dominant market, and smaller companies might just be flooded out by them. So that'll be very interesting to see in how they maintain that.
If I may, I want to jump in here on the point. I appreciate Alex for bringing that up. Look, we are headed toward legalization in one way or another, whether we're going to get there in this administration or the next. I happen to have a lot of faith in our incoming Secretary of Agriculture, former Iowa Governor Tom Vilsack, and this will be his second time around in that post as he formerly occupied it in the Obama administration. And I think that while the introduction of legalized cannabis in this country will certainly add, regulatory challenges that larger companies may be able to take advantage of, it's not something we can't handle. And you already are starting to see companies like Philo, which is headed by Aristotle Loomis. It's based here in the Midwest, that are helping small and mid-sized companies with the existing regulatory issues across the country. And as companies like Philo continue to do their work to help other businesses scale and navigate regulatory red tape, I think you're going to see a little more parity. As we know, there's a lot of money to be made in cannabis. And I don't think the legalization of cannabis here in the United States is going to prove too cumbersome of regulatory challenges. It's something that should be on everyone's radar in the federal government already. And I suspect it is, given the amount of attention this issue has been getting in the last year or so.
So then on the question of to bring it back to really what the first sort of topic we discussed was on the justice component, it reminds me of the end of alcohol prohibition. And Emily, maybe you can speak to this specific thing, and frankly, whether you could tell me whether I've been misinformed, but my understanding is that when they ended alcohol prohibition, there was essentially an amnesty for bootleggers, for lack of a better term, to, switch over to the legal industry that has not been even contemplated in the context of cannabis. Is that completely unreasonable to think that we could get to that historical parallel, or is the times just way too different now?
Well, I kind of have to bring it back to like America's relationship with racism, right?
Right.
We were talking about a lot of white bootleggers, and we're talking about Black and brown people who've been disproportionately accused of and arrested for and convicted of marijuana involvement. Because white people are generally not policed. Like white people use marijuana at higher rates than Black and brown people, but don't get policed in the same way. Right, exactly. You've got, white moms smoking joints in the park and Black moms being arrested for just walking outside in the Bronx. So what I wanted to point out, and this is a depressing reality, but I want to bring it up so that everyone who's watching this and engaged with the subject matter can start thinking about it now, and we can use our collective brain power to come up with a good solution. Federal regulation isn't the only hurdle we're talking about here. Constitutionally, America reserves criminal law to the states. And that means that there are literally thousands of individual state regulatory bars on various forms of employment licensure for people with convictions, which is like the world of what having a prior conviction can block you from is an absolute like nightmare Byzantine jungle. So we need real state efforts to remove those bars on employability, not just really for people with marijuana convictions. I mean, the best way to encourage economic mobility in your state is probably to let more people work and get jobs. Not refusing to let somebody become a barber because they've done time is ridiculous. We are not in the era of Sweeney Todd. And the same thing applies to the marijuana industry.
That's all I'm going to think of the next time I get a haircut. Thank you.
No, it's actually really ridiculous because people can learn barbering in prison and then you get out and you're not allowed to get a license to become a barber. And the same thing with a lot of other industries that people take part in while doing time. So the state licensure problem is massive, and we have to address it and we have to get out in front of it. I think that's going to be a real knot to untangle. Ideally in this year. I want to be more optimistic than Stacey. Let's do it this year. Let's just fix it this year, and then we don't have to worry about it later. How about that?
Let's get in a race for optimism. How about that? I like it. More positive. It's not going to be me. The Canadians always have to bow to some other more optimistic force. Final point that I think is worth discussing here in the time that we have remaining. I just got the 2-minute warning, so I'll give each of you one last thought. In an environment of federal legalization, what the heck happens to all the siloed state level regimes where all the operators, even the ones that are multi-state, they replicate their entire footprint in every state right now because they have to? It's going to be a big mess, isn't it? When federal legalization swoops over. And Alex, did you want to have one last word on that subject?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's going to cause a bit of panic for these multi-state operators. Obviously, they're going to feel like they're being treated unfairly if they've gone through so much effort when it wasn't federally legalized, and then suddenly it is. and then anyone from anywhere can actually just start up shop in a better and more efficient way than they can. But that's the way loads of new markets go. I mean, it's evolving, and the players have to evolve with it. That's the deal of the game, Yeah. And that's just unlucky, I guess. I can't say anything else.
You're lucky in love. Emily, any final thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I think that with being local, even if you are multi-state, but having local roots comes a certain competitive advantage, right? And I think we can absolutely there's a conversation to be had around, how much federal support there should be built into any legalization initiative for existing business interests and local shops that are thriving. I'm reflecting on the book Good Profit by Charles Koch and how much he would hate that idea. But no, I think when I bring up locality, I'm bringing it up as an important point, not just for competitive advantage and for preserving the people who've put in a lot of work to build this industry already, but also because so much of the regulatory regime and problems that we encounter for the folks I'm talking about are local at our state level, that I think investment in state by state initiatives to broaden equity is going to be actually more important than any federal initiative for equity. So for me, the equity concern is tied deeply to the locality concern.
Stacey, the final thought to you on that.
I agree with what both Alex and Emily have said, and I wish I could leave it at that, but I'll just add one more quick point.
Hey.
I do think with wholesale federal legalization of cannabis in this country, surely there will be a lot of challenges, particularly between interstate operations. But I do think we will see such an influx of investment into the cannabis industry that will be able to allay those concerns. And as I mentioned earlier, you've already got companies like Philo out there helping with regulatory issues for several different small and mid-sized companies. And I think that industry in and of itself, the sort of regulatory navigation industry, is going to grow. So I am pretty optimistic that with cannabis legalization, we will be presented with new challenges, but we'll be able to solve them.
That's an excellent note to end on. I like ending on with just a little optimism that's just ever so slightly above Emily. So I'll give the crown to Stacey there. Thank you all so much for your time. This has been an enthralling conversation. I certainly learned a lot. For those of you who have been listening and following along, remember the report is available now. So you can go to Prohibition Partners website and check it out. And thanks all so much for joining us. And here's to a further pursuit of progress here in 2021.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.